And so that brings us to our speaker tonight, Anna Sale, who was for many years a political reporter for WNYC. And in the changes in the news business, a lot of people are, struggling to keep their place in the newsroom, and with difficulties in the news industry also open up new opportunities with podcasting and other avenues. And so Anna has recreated her career in a very popular podcast, Death, Sex, and Money, where she also talks about the most difficult subjects and finds a way to open up our ears and our hearts to the hard questions. So with that, I want to turn it over to Anna Sale.
Thank you, Vince. My name is Anna Sale. I host Death, Sex, and Money, which is a podcast from New York Public Radio from WNYC Studios. I'm actually based here in the East Bay. I live in Berkeley. I work out of Emeryville in the studios of Reveal, the investigative podcast, which I know some of you are aware of. They are wonderful office mates, and it's a privilege to work alongside them. So I want to tell you a bit about my own personal journey through this journalism landscape that we are all trying to figure out how to best both serve our existing audiences, meet them where they are, and also to do the really important work of trying to repair harm to our civic society, our democratic society, to our social lives. And that's might sound lofty, but that's how I think of what we're trying to do at Death, Sex, and Money as well. So let me tell you a bit about my journey from kind of being in the middle of a scrum of a press corps covering politics to trying to create conversation and journalism in a different way that served audiences in a different way. So I want to start going back in time this is Anna version 2012. That's me at the Democratic National Convention doing sort of kind of very conventional political journalism. I think at that point I was doing what we thought we were supposed to do to serve our audience, which was both file radio. We also had a political blog that we had launched with contributors from across the political spectrum. We were just kind of trying to do digital journalism while we were doing public radio journalism at the same time. And I felt really strongly about if I was covering a presidential campaign, I didn't want to just show up at the conventions and also the political rallies and the rope lines and get the activists telling me sound bites. I wanted to try to really understand what was the mood in different American communities, in particular swing states, to understand what was going on. So this is a swing state road trip I did in the summer of 2012. Stopped at a bunch of different states. And I just want to start with this because I met a woman here named Jennifer Erickson, and something she told me just really, really stuck with me, and I just want to play. I asked her, how do you feel about how things are going in the United States? And this is 2012 in Iowa, and at the smallest county in Iowa, which had gone for Barack Obama in 2008 and George W. Bush in 2004. And this is what she said.
Our annual salary probably runs between Mike and I a good 60 to 65, 70,000, and we're having a tough time making it. I go to work every day, put in 40 hours or more a week. So does my husband. My husband's now working 60 hours a week, and we still can't make it. Why? That's what I want to have those two explain to me. Why am I not making it? I should be. I live in the Midwest where supposedly it's cheaper to live, and you still can't make it. Why?
So I think you hear there a woman grappling with American capitalism in 2012 and what she felt like she had signed up for and what she had earned and what she had been promised was not showing up for her in the way that she expected, and also in the way that it had for her parents before her. So you hear this sort of sense of frustration about diminishing returns and also not hearing anyone articulate why this is happening. It feels personal to her and no one is saying what is happening. The next slide, I'm going to just describe to you this scene. It's 2013. Obama has won the 2012 election, and I move on to covering the New York mayor's race in 2013. And this is a press conference that I covered. You might recognize on the left is Anthony Weiner. He was a former New York City congressman who had resigned from office because he got caught sexting with young women. This press conference, he was acknowledging that after he had resigned from Congress for sexting with young women, he had sexted again with young women. And this is in the course of his race to be New York City's next mayor. And during that press conference, there's this whole crew of reporters, and everybody's asking, like, wait, did you do the text in July 2012 after you did the People magazine interview where you said you didn't? It was all these questions about the timeline of who he had sexted and when, and then it was over, and they start walking away, Huma Abedin and Anthony Weiner, and you see me sitting in the floor, and I have headphones on because I'm a radio reporter, and I'm having to be close enough with my microphone, and you just see me start shouting, "Why should we trust your judgment? Why should we trust your judgment?" And they both pause and they look at me, and then they walk away. And it was this moment of profound sort of disappointment with the press corps in the sense that he was running and asking for votes in New York City, and no one had said, should this give us pause about your judgment? And then also that was a question that he didn't think he needed to answer. So
I love him. I have forgiven him. I believe in him. And as we have said from the beginning, we are moving forward. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
Can you explain why should we trust your judgment? Why did your phone number? Why should we trust your judgment?
So that led me to kind of a moment where I was thinking, what am I doing as a political journalist? I'm meeting people like Jennifer Erickson. I'm summing up her sense of frustration with what's going on into an anecdotal lead, into a story that I then tell about how the polls are going between Obama and Romney. I'm not sitting with that story. So I was feeling the people I'm covering are not feeling heard, and I'm not actually helping with the journalism I'm doing. I'm asking questions of the people who are in power, and I'm not getting honest answers. And I felt like my stories were highlighting divisions and not increasing understanding. So this is like, I'm not achieving what I had hoped to achieve when I got into trying to cover our government and civic society. So this is a picture of me in that moment in New York City, just looking pensive, trying to figure out what to do next. And around this time, I get this email, and you can't read the words, but I will tell you that it went out to every person at WNYC who worked there. And it was from Chris Bannon, who was in charge of developing new content. And it was just this wonderful invitation. It was a contest announcement to anyone who worked in the building for new show ideas. And there I was, like, doing my political journalism, trying to do the job that I'd signed up to do. And this invitation shows up. And I think, like, oh, if I could tell stories in a different way, what would it look like? And then I kind of stopped to consider the New York Public Radio mission statement. And I think it's one of the most profound in all of public media, because it's not just about telling stories, it's not just about entertainment, it's not about education, it's about something far deeper than that. It's about to make the mind more curious, the heart more open, and the spirit more joyful through excellent audio programming that's deeply rooted in New York. And so I thought, kind of looking at that, like, there's room to do something a little bit different. So I started thinking, like, what do I want to hear about? I want to hear Jennifer Erickson talk more at length about what's going on in her life. I want to hear her be sort of challenged a little bit about how she feels and who she blames. I also want to hear things about relationships and family, and how family is changing, and how the models we've had are changing. And I also wanted to talk about, like, why this all matters, which is the fact that all of us are mortal. People we love are going to die, and we are going to die. So let's be real about that, and let's also acknowledge that. So that became my show, Death, Sex, and Money. It was the show I pitched. And this is too many words for you to read, but this is the first question in the contest entry, which was a beautiful invitation, which was just like 300 words, what's your elevator pitch for what you're going to do differently? And at the time, I didn't know what it was going to sound like. I didn't know how I was going to make it. I didn't know how many resources it was going to take. But I knew I wanted to make a show that had the spirit of kind of, we're all moving through a very profound economic and social transformation in American society. And I want to explore that, but also with a sense of humor and a spirit that we're not alone in figuring this out. So that was the idea. And then, as a longtime broadcast journalist who files a story, submits it to my editors, they put it in the magic machines, and then it shows up in people's speakers when they're driving through the Holland Tunnel, I had to face the question of, like, wait. If I start a podcast, I could try to make the most beautiful, precious piece of audio, and no one could press play. So how do I make the argument for someone to press play? For media to have impact, people have to listen. And so if we're trying to find audiences in new ways, where do we find them? And I want to play you the first little bit of tape of the very first episode of Death, Sex, and Money, because it was an interview that I did with the musician Bill Withers. And I didn't know what I was doing, but it was just like confirmed for me that I was going to make something really good. So I just want to play Bill Withers' introduction to his episode.
Don't worry about that, sugar. If something bothers me, I would say I don't want to talk about that. I'm not that fragile,
This is
Death, sex, and money.
Death is just a part of life.
It's the show from WNYC about the things we think about a lot.
Do you like sex?
And need to talk about more.
There's more to life than a little money,
I'm Anna Sale.
Who in the world would come up with a title like that?
It's all the essential stuff, right?
Yeah. If you reverse them, it's a story of a lot of people's lives. That's the story of rock and roll right there.
So Bill Withers is a fellow West Virginian, so he did me a solid when he agreed to an interview for my very first episode of my podcast that didn't exist. And that became a really beautiful, we called that episode How to Be a Man with Bill Withers. And it was about growing up in the coal camps in West Virginia, a light-skinned kid who lived on one side among black people, on the other side among white people as he crossed between his dad and his mom's house, growing up with a stutter, and all the guys that were really mean to him, and the one guy who wasn't, and what that taught him about how to be a man. And then we went on to talk about other things in his life. It sort of taught me that interview that there was just a way of like, if you just create the space, people are gonna share. If you tell them, I'm gonna make a show where we're talking about the things we all go through but that we struggle with talking about, people will show up. And another thing that we've learned at Death, Sex, and Money is that there's a lot of really good content if you go to your audience with very open questions. Some people call that engagement. We call that reporting. It's something we did after the 2016 election. We felt, as many of you did feel, that there was a profound sense of kind of like just misalignment and disorientation and not understanding who we were as a people, or if you were a Trump supporter feeling like, oh yeah, now you're paying attention to me, aren't you? So we wanted to capture that. So this is a question that we put out first over social media. What do you wish other Americans understood about you that they don't? And it became something that we shared. This one, I wish other Americans understood what it's like feeling unwanted, unsafe, and lost. I wish other Americans knew how hard it is to be a farmer. I wish people understood that voting for Trump doesn't make you a hillbilly without a degree or have zero compassion for anyone with a different walk of life than you. And it became first this social campaign where it's sort of all over Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and then we decided to do a live call-in show that went out on WNYC and then became one of our most popular podcast episodes we've ever done, and we just called it Other Americans, and I'm just going to play a little bit of that tape.
I feel like the thing that I want other Americans to know about me.
I want people to understand.
I wish other people understood that.
I want to be able to continue to work hard and pay my taxes.
It doesn't mean that I'm a racist or a bigot.
I'm just feeling so sad today.
It can be really lonely not seeing many people like me succeed.
They don't know that I'm not only legal, but American.
We all have our various parts of us that are other.
And I think this is something that more people could relate to if they would listen.
So what you hear there, that audio is actually voice memo tape. It's a tool that we use often on the show where we say, if you want to answer this question, just pick up your smartphone. There's a voice memo tool where you can record yourself, email it in, and you get these very intimate sounding recordings. Sometimes people are driving, sometimes people are walking in the woods, sometimes they're just talking in their house. But it feels like you're capturing them where they are. Another thing about our show is when you're called Death, Sex, and Money, you have to actually ask the questions that you might not say at a dinner party or at a fundraising event. You have to sort of like push the conversation in a way, because that's what you're promising your audience. And one thing that we did last year was we said, we want to talk about class in America, we want to talk about inequality, and we want to talk about it as a personal experience. So we asked our listeners to tell us a moment when they felt their class identity, to tell us a story about that. And it led to this really wonderful conversation between a young man named Nishant and his father, Vic. Nishant is a student at UC Berkeley. His father, Vic, lives in the Midwest, and when Nishant was growing up, Vic sold a very successful biotech company and made a lot of money. And this is a picture that Vic sent us of his Ferraris in his garage, because he says at one point in our interview that the second red car doesn't feel as good as the first red car. So he's self-aware about what it's been like to experience becoming quite wealthy. But I want to play this clip of tape for you where Vic talks a little bit more about that, what it's felt like to become very, very rich.
You know, when Cinderella gets ahead, so to speak, it's always Cinderella's surrounded by mean stepsisters and a mom and an environment that wasn't helping, and it was unfair. So when you arrive upon some really awesome destination, you're supposed to sort of go, well, they deserve it and the other people were mean. And I think the reality is that, at least in our case or my case, you know, you find yourself here, but along the way, they weren't mean people. In fact, it's because of all the people that were around you that you got here, and not everybody's at the same place. And so you're left wondering about that.
So that's another thing we try to do on Death, Sex, and Money, and also kind of going back to the Jennifer Erickson tape in Iowa, we try to make the structural personal and the personal structural. So what that means is we want to talk about the big stuff happening in our society, but we want to talk about it through very concrete stories. And we want to talk about the very concrete stories so that whatever shame you're feeling about something you're going through, you can see the way it fits into a larger structure. That's something we did really well with this series we did about student loans. We just asked our audience again, tell us how having student debt has affected the milestones of your adulthood. And I'm just going to play a clip. We did a whole series about that, and this is the very beginning to that series. We have a lot of student debt in the United States. More people,
everybody has student debt,
are taking out more loans.
I thought I was going to be able to pay all this off in a snap.
And taking a longer time to pay them back.
And the phone calls come, and the emails come, and the letters come, and they treat us like criminals.
We have more student loan debt than credit card debt in this country. Over $1 trillion, split among some 40 million Americans.
I am about
88,000.
10,000.
241,000.
134000.
Thousands and thousands of dollars into student debt.
When we asked you for your stories about student loan debt, hundreds of you responded. It's the biggest response we've ever gotten, in fact. But even though so many of us have student loans, many of you said they feel like a secret.
My own husband, he has no idea.
I have blatantly lied to my friends about student loans.
I carry guilt, but mostly embarrassment.
In so many ways, I felt embarrassed.
I feel like a big fat friggin' loser.
Did you talk to anybody about student loans?
No, because I couldn't. I felt like a complete idiot. Like, that I put myself in this position. I think the only person I told was my mother, and she was like, oh, you'll be okay. Because she doesn't really, I mean, she didn't want to tell me how fucked up the situation was.
This is Sharif. When we talked, he was in his car, parked outside his office. None of his coworkers know he has more than $100,000 in federal and private student loans.
I don't know how else to put it except that I almost made it. I'm still unsuccessful financially.
So you hear there, Sharif is an engineer, and he goes on in that interview to talk about the question of whether, as a Bangladeshi immigrant, he's better off having decided to go to school and taking out student loans to become an engineer, or if he would have been better off just not trying to get educated. And when we first spoke, he was kind of very much in that in-between zone of saying, like, did I believe something that ended up not being true? And it was the first episode of several that we did. This is another piece of our reporting. We ended up creating a map where more than 4,000 people kind of just confessed how much student loan debt they had and how they felt about it and what they were doing as a result of it. So it was something that people could sort of privately study. And then we came back to Sharif a year later, and what was really cool about it was to hear that not only had just talking about his student loan debt made it feel more manageable, like he could put his shoulders down a little bit more, but then hearing how other people had like integrated that debt into their adulthoods, and that it wasn't this big private shame, that it was a reality. He'd refinanced his debt. He was feeling much more sort of in control. And that was the result of just like talking about his student debt on a podcast. So that's something that we have found that's really special about podcasting, that's I think distinct from broadcast. When you're creating a podcast, you have this narrative flow. So our audience sticks with us. They follow the characters that we introduce them to. Like Sharif, like a young woman named Rashima Melson, who I want to tell you about because it's another really, really great story. Rashima I met because she's a young woman who grew up in Washington, D.C. She was in a homeless shelter when she was finishing high school, and she got a full ride to Georgetown. And so she became known nationally as the homeless valedictorian. There were all these feel-good stories about the quote-unquote homeless valedictorian. And then she shows up at Georgetown, and we interviewed her first partway through her freshman year about just like what it was like at Georgetown. And it was pretty clear that she was struggling with where her sort of center was. Was it at Georgetown? She was going back and forth to Anacostia, where her family was. She wasn't really bought into Georgetown. So we stayed in touch. And sure enough, a few months later, we saw online that Rashima had decided to leave Georgetown. She dropped out. She got married. She moved to a military base where her husband was stationed, and she was going to a state school. And I caught up with her on her cell phone. You'll hear on this tape, because we wanted to just interview her and see what was going on, see what had happened and why she made those choices. And on the day that I ended up calling her, it was as she had just decided to end that marriage and to return to Washington and to try to go back to Georgetown. I want to play you that tape.
I feel like, like when we talked, and I was talking about how I feel about when people call me like the homeless valedictorian, or just a lot of expectations that people put over my head.
Yeah.
I think with leaving Georgetown, I felt like I was leaving that life behind. But then it occurred to me, like, why run away from, like, what I want to do, what I'm destined to do, just because people are showing me that they're on my side. I think all my life, like, my mom wasn't the kind of parent that's like, oh, you got straight A's, good job, keep it up, make sure, it was always me on my own telling me I need to do this, or this is the best thing for me. So when I had all those people in my corner, I didn't know how to receive that. It's just like the whole, like, Britney Spears having a meltdown, because she's like a public, like, some people just can't handle all that pressure at once. And I feel like that's what I had, like a little meltdown.
A little Britney Spears moment.
Yeah, or like a Kanye moment.
Yeah. So she says there she was having a Britney Spears moment and then a Kanye moment, if you didn't quite hear that, which I thought was funny. We got an email right after, as I was coming back from maternity leave this spring, that Rashima was finishing at Georgetown. She'd gone back. She finished. And she wrote to us an email about how meaningful it was to be able to listen back to those 2 interviews we'd done, that we had captured her, she said, in her weakest yet bravest moments. And now she's working for a nonprofit, an anti-poverty nonprofit in Washington, D.C. So we cheer Rashima on. So that's something that is really also part of the spirit of the show, is we want to create journalism that brings in our full selves. And we do that with people who aren't famous, but we also do it with people who are famous. This is a live show that we did in Brooklyn a few years ago, and we had all these celebrity guests, but we asked them to bring a family member with them. So that would be a sort of different interview than you'd heard before. That's Rosie Perez with her cousin Sixto Ramos. That's Mahershala Ali with his wife Amatus. And that is Hari Kondabolu, the comedian, with his mother Uma Kondabolu. And we followed up with many of these people. Uma has been a guest on the show many times, including talking to me about what it's been like to retire from her job working in a cath lab and to figure out, for the first time in her life, she's not serving anyone else and she's trying to figure out how to fill her time. And I talked to her about that just as I was returning from maternity leave after my second child, and it was this really beautiful exchange across moments of where we were in life, and she had wonderful advice. And speaking of bringing in our full selves, I want to introduce you to Vanessa and Freddie, who were 2 people who were on the show last year. And to set up this tape, I want you to know that I talked to them, this moment is hearing about as they were just getting to know each other. They live in New Jersey, and Vanessa is describing a moment just after she had had a fight that had gotten out of hand with her sister who struggles with bipolar disorder, and they were coming home from a family dinner, and food was sort of strewn all across Vanessa's car, and that's where the tape picks up.
Everywhere, rice, beans, pernil, with just like roasted pork. It was everywhere. My glasses broke. It was a disaster. So of course I tell him, don't worry about it. We'll see each other tomorrow, because like I have to deal with something. And he had no idea anything about my sister, and his instinct was just to come to the house and see if everything was okay. He just showed up. And he's, what happened? So I just start bawling, right? I can't even say anything. And he said, you know what? He had given me a flashlight. That was the first thing he ever gave me, was a flashlight bat to protect myself walking to and from the bus stop.
A flashlight.
Yeah. It's like a titanium steel. It's like 3 feet long. So it was in my car. And he said, just hold the flashlight. He cleaned the entire car that night. And I'm intermittently going from sobbing because I'm so upset that this event has occurred, to being grateful, to them being embarrassed, all these things. And he was just there, like when he was cleaning my car, he's like, don't worry, you're not alone anymore. I got this.
When did you tell Vanessa, Freddie, that you had DACA and had previously been undocumented?
I think it was like a month or two after.
So I wanted to play that tape for you that way because this originally started because Vanessa wrote us an email to our show inbox that the subject was, I married a dreamer during the Trump presidency. But we wanted to tell the story as a love story and about what it meant to be in your 30s, to have DACA, to fall in love. Vanessa is Dominican. When she found out Freddie had DACA, she was like, oh, we'll just figure this out. My family's been going back and forth to the DR all the time. We'll figure this out. And Freddie's like, no, that's not how it's working. And so it's about both of their interactions with the immigration system in this country, and Vanessa sort of coming to know that uncertainty was just going to be a part of their lives as a result of his immigration status. So one other important part about our journalism is that it has humility. And this isn't something that I was comfortable with when I started as a political reporter, transitioning to being a podcast host about very personal subjects, because I'm used to yelling indignant, self-righteous questions to politicians at press conferences. And I had a story, but something was unfolding in my life just as I was starting the podcast, and I want to play you this little bit of tape to set it up.
Ms. Anna Sales, this is Alan K. Simpson in the wilds of Wyoming, former U.S. Senator.
This is a message I got on my cell phone.
Need to talk to you about an urgent matter. Nothing life-threatening at all, I can assure you.
So that's a message I got on my cell phone. True fact. Alan K. Simpson, former senator from Wyoming. That's his wife, Ann, his wife of more than 60 years, and I went on to meet them. And what that episode was about, it's one of the very first episodes of Death, Sex, and Money. It was about how my own love life and questions about relationships were very much up in the air as I was starting the show. At the time, I was dating a man who was a wildlife biologist who studies large mammals, and I was living in New York City being a journalist and was trying to figure out if this thing had a future. And we were together, we were in love, we broke up. I was like, dude, you work outside of Yellowstone. I don't know how this is gonna work. But sure enough, Arthur, he was winning an award at a museum, and I was supposed to be his date right before our breakup. Alan K. Simpson, senator from Wyoming, was supposed to be at this dinner, and Arthur thought it would make me smile to have Alan Simpson call and make his case that I should just come and be his date at this event. And what ended up happening as a result of that cell phone call was, because of the nature of Al and Ann in particular, but also because I was pushing myself to just say, there's a lot I don't know how to do. how do you do this? How do you do relationships? And they beautifully opened up about their marriage, about their couples counseling, about the years when he was in Washington and she was in Wyoming, what was tough about it, what she had to put up with, what she was pissed at him about after the Clarence Thomas hearings. And they told me all of this in an interview. And it was told kind of with my own story nested inside of it. And so I did end up going to the ball. I was Arthur's date. And then there's this piece of tape from that episode. Then the ball ended, and I had a plane to catch the next morning, and I didn't know what to tell Arthur about what would happen next. Because it wasn't just the distance that had made it hard for us. I was also really scared of committing to a relationship that wasn't going to work. I'm divorced. I'm in my 30s, and I want to be a mother. And I was so afraid of making the wrong choice again and losing time. Anne says that night at the ball, she could tell.
I saw there were some wounds there.
What'd you see?
Well, it was a little touchy. You were a little, a little standoffish. And thought, well, either it'll work or it won't. But at least you were willing to give it a try.
Yeah.
If it cratered, I wouldn't lose a bit of sleep. Not a bit. Not really, I mean that, because you've done what you can do.
And that's something else we found out through Death, Sex, and Money was that while I started the show with this idea that so much was in flux, there's also something quite profound about gathering around things that aren't new, that are timeless, that you can swap stories across time about. One of our most popular episodes is about breakups. And I want to play a piece of tape from a listener named Nan, who wrote in about the experience of her husband leaving her when she was in her 60s.
He fell in love with his student who was 25, and it came as rather a great shock, actually.
What was it like those first days after he moved out?
Terrible. I thought about suicide. There's a great feeling of rejection, and especially, I think, if you're older. You feel like an older woman who will never have another, relationship, and you just feel ugly and invisible and sad and quite gray. The feeling of grayness was very strong.
I love that interview with Nan. You should know that Anne and her husband eventually reconciled, and then she talked about his death from cancer and being alongside him during that death. That's where that interview goes. And out of that episode about breakups, you can't really see this on all of the screens, but we try to meet our listeners again in a lot of places where they are. So we thought it would be fun to create a Google Doc where everyone could just edit it together, and we called it the Breakup Survival Kit. And the tabs at the bottom say things to do, things to think, things to watch, things to listen to. And you can see in the very top right corner all those little animals. Those are all anonymous people who are in there looking around and editing it. So you can just sort of see it being built by the community of Death, Sex, and Money all at once. And another listener took that spreadsheet and said, oh, this is really cool. It's not that beautiful. And she made this incredible online version of it where you can just go. It's breakupsurvival.guide. And you go and you just hit that button, let's go, my heart hurts. And it just goes through things to listen to. Your ex lover is dead by Stars. Something to do, fix your posture if you're going through a breakup. Something to watch, The Joy Luck Club. This movie makes me cry every single time, says Deneen. So it's just another way that we wanted to just bring everyone together around this idea that this isn't something that you're struggling with by yourself. So that is how we have tried to make journalism that heals as it provokes. The provoking is to acknowledge that there's a lot. We're going to catch your attention because we're going to talk about stuff that you're thinking about, but we're also going to create a community and a sense of skills and a sense of willingness to say out loud what you're struggling with, and that does, I think, lead to healing. And I had a wonderful phone conversation with a listener named Emma. We were just doing a pledge drive for Death, Sex, and Money members, and part of the prize was that if you became a sustaining member, that I was going to call you on your phone. It was going to be a surprise. And it turned out I called all these phone numbers, and nobody picks up their phone. So you'll hear Emma finally picked up her phone. Here's a bit of that.
Hello, this is Emma.
Hey, Emma, this is Anna Sale from Death, Sex, and Money.
Oh my gosh. Hi.
Hi, how are you? You answered your phone.
I did answer my phone.
So Emma was on lunch break in Brooklyn, and we talked for a bit. I thanked her for becoming a supporter of Death, Sex, and Money. And then I had that very satisfying experience of having someone say back to you that the thing that you wrote in a Google Doc years before about what you were trying to accomplish, hearing somebody say it back to you in the words that you sort of wished that someone would say was the impact that you were having. Here's what Emma had to say. If one of your fellow listeners is listening right now who maybe thinks they might give, they have intentions to give, but haven't done it yet, like what would be the thing that you would say to them right now?
I mean, I think Death, Sex, and Money is really good at opening up conversations. That's the whole premise of the show, that people have a hard time, discussing topics people don't know how to talk about, topics that people are afraid to talk about. And I think there is something that is so valuable about normalizing these topics of conversation. I think it is a really important public service, and I have personally had really intense responses to a lot of the topics that you guys have covered. I mean, student debt. You had a topic a couple of months ago that I just stopped through the entire episode. It was about people who have friends who are in such financially different situations and how you cope with that. And it just really resonated with me. They're just really affecting pieces of journalism, and I'm glad that I can support it in a small way because I get a lot from it.
So that's Emma, that's one of our listeners. And I'm really proud of that. And we're trying to figure out how coming into the next election season, we can continue to create that sense of both deal with the exhaustion and to create an experience where you listen to something, you might feel recognition, you might be confronting really hard things, but you end the experience of the episode more ready to do something, more ready to face it than you were when you press play. So one of the ways we're trying to do that is we're developing a series about climate and about climate grief, climate dread, climate anxiety, but how to not just sort of sit and wallow in that, but then what is step 2, 3, 4, working with psychologists and also creating a conversation around you're not the only one who's thinking about, was it a mistake to have kids? Who's thinking about, should I make that retirement contribution? Who's thinking about oh my God, what am I leaving my child as I'm in my 60s and 70s? So that's something we're looking at doing. We're also looking at a series about homelessness and housing, and just starting again on that idea of making the structural personal and the personal structural, just going really deep on where people are living, how they're paying for it, and how that affects everything else. I mean, it's something we talk about all the time in the Bay Area, but really going sort of deep and personal on a series of very different people's experiences. And we're also developing a Sunday live call-in show at WNYC. It's something I'm piloting with my colleague Kai Wright, who's the host of a show called The Stakes at WNYC. And it's around gathering around the news, but not in that way that's let's talk about polls and let's talk about the same thing that you've heard on Twitter, on cable news, on the New York Times homepage, but let's gather together and process this together so then we can turn toward the week ahead and feel a little bit more ready. So that's what we've learned through making Death, Sex, and Money, that journalism that listens, that journalism that builds community, that journalism that has feelings. I think that's something that public media hasn't always felt comfortable with, but really it's okay to have feelings, and often mixed feelings. You can leave an experience feeling ambivalence. That's important, sitting with that. That is journalism that heals as it provokes. And that's also journalism that is very much rooted in the long-time mission of New York Public Radio, making the mind more curious, the heart more open, and the spirit more joyful. So this is my group of podcasts that I'm among at New York Public Radio. I feel so honored to work alongside so many talented media makers, Radiolab, The Stakes, Nancy, The Takeaway, On the Media, Snap Judgment, just some of them. And thank you so much for your attention. I know you've had a long day. I really appreciate being able to speak with you. Have a wonderful night.